Welcome, everybody, to episode 51 of Generation Jihad. We are finally over the 50 episode mark. Woohoo. Hey, Bill.
Yes, it's time.
So we're on to episode 51, and I'm, of course, Tom Joscelyn. I'm here with Bill Roggio. We're your senior fellows at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. We've been running FDD's Long War Journal for many years now. And we're pleased again this week to have a guest to share with you who can talk about some of the work that he and his colleagues are performing these days. He is Edmund Fitton-Brown. He has a long career working for the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He was Her Majesty's Ambassador to the Republic of Yemen from February 2015 until February 2017. And he's currently the coordinator for the UN Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team, which covers ISIS, al-Qaeda, and the Taliban. And as longtime readers of the Long War Journal know, we always dive into the reports that Edmund and his team file. So we're always happy to have him on to talk about them. Edmund, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Tom. Great to be on.
So I guess let's get right into it. Again, in the previous episode of the podcast, you kind of explained what you and your team, how you do your work, how you go about authoring these reports. You have a new report out on Afghanistan, the Taliban, al-Qaeda, and ISIS in Afghanistan. Has a lot of interesting nuggets in it, which we're going to dive into. But maybe just give listeners a brief overview of how you guys do what you do.
Absolutely. Happy to do so, Tom. So the monitoring team has essentially two functions. One is that it provides technical support to the UN committees that are responsible for the sanctions on al-Qaeda, ISIL, and the Taliban. And secondly, we write the threat assessment, both the threat assessment from ISIL and al-Qaeda, and also the threat assessment in terms of what threat the Taliban poses to peace and security in Afghanistan. And our methodology is essentially that we talk to member states, counterterrorism, and other relevant agencies, including intelligence services, and we do not relay reporting from non-state actors. We don't run sources. So the reports that we write are all essentially based on member state reporting. In the case of this particular report that we're looking at today, we also have a lot of assistance from the UN presence inside Afghanistan, UNAMA, but we are the ones who make all of the editorial judgments.
No, that's great. And that's the main reason why Bill and I have focused in on your reporting through the years, is because we can get a sense of what member states are saying, in terms of relaying intelligence and their perceptions of things. The previous episode of this podcast, episode 50, was a typically nerdy issue of our podcast, or edition of our podcast, in which we discussed at length the analytical problems that still sort of besiege the community, the counterterrorism community, in terms of understanding how al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Taliban, and affiliated groups are structured, how they're organized, and how they work. And so we always pick through your reports to see what member states are saying to that along those lines, the little nuggets that are there. But let's start with the big picture here before we get into some of those little nuggets. The first thing is, you do paint a very grim picture of what the Taliban is doing in Afghanistan currently in terms of war fighting. That picture is entirely consistent with the work that Bill's been doing for years at the Long War Journal. That's something that he noticed right away. And maybe you could talk a little bit about your assessment from the report of what's going on currently in Afghanistan.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you call it a grim picture. I suppose the one thing I would say is I think it's a consistent picture. I think it's consistent with what we've reported in the past. Yep. We write these reports on Afghanistan once a year, and I would characterize the picture that we've painted in this latest report as being an evolution consistent with what we reported a year earlier and before that. I think going to your point specifically on how the Taliban is acting. They are not behaving in the manner of an organization that has a strong commitment to compromise or reconciliation or peace. They've continued to raise the levels of violence in Afghanistan, and considering that there is an understanding that is being implemented, the Doha Accord from the end of February 2020, which has seen prisoner releases and has seen the agreement to withdrawal of foreign troops from Afghanistan, it is striking to me that the Taliban do not appear to have done anything very much that they could not easily reverse, or to have made any really substantive compromises.
Bill, you had a question?
Yes, Edmund. Yeah. So I noted in here that you discuss. Yeah, I'll just quote it directly. It says, according to member states, the Taliban now contest or control an estimated 50 to 70% of Afghan territory outside of urban centers, while also exerting direct control over 57% of district administrative centers. End quote there. So, one of the things I do at the Long War Journal is I started this in 2014, is to track how the security in the districts, right? What the Taliban controls, what they contest, what the Afghan government controls. And to be perfectly clear, it's a very difficult process, using news sources. When the U.S. military was providing that information, the SIGAR, what Taliban claims, what government officials are saying. So, now obviously we're not talking an apples to apples situation here. You guys mentioned territory outside urban centers, and I'm not discussing specific districts. So can you tell me a little bit about how is that determined, that percentage? Are they just are the member states just giving you a rough estimate, or is there, I guess I'm most curious, where does that 50% of district centers under Taliban control, how is that determined? If you can provide information on that, I understand a lot of this may be sensitive, Edmund.
So, Bill, it's really what we do is we take the member state information and we sort of triangulate it and produce the best sort of analysis that we can from what we're being told. Obviously we don't talk about which member states, but
sure.
We're obviously talking to a wide range of people, and you could no doubt guess some of them. What we're looking at here is not so much being given a list of every single district in Afghanistan, and this one is and that one isn't. It's more an estimate that we've been given by several member states, where this is this is a reasonable representation of the average of what we're being told. Importantly, I think it's more to do with trends. It's the fact that I often feel this with the numbers that we cite, that it's a question of in what direction is the situation moving? Are the Taliban controlling and contesting more ground than they were? To which the answer is yes, rather than any sort of magical significance to the figures themselves. There's also another key point here, which is, and this is consistent with the Taliban's sort of military approach of the last couple of years, which is that they haven't sought to. They've put more emphasis on contesting ground than they have on controlling ground. And I think that's because, they recognize that controlling ground or massing forces in order to take high-profile targets made them vulnerable to counterattack. And that's counterattack, which, of course, would be very concerned about the counterattack from not just the Afghan forces, but the Afghan forces' international allies. Even so, the fact is that even without international support, the Afghan forces are stronger than they used to be, and they have significant capabilities. And therefore, from the Taliban's point of view, that tactic may still be relevant. But essentially what they're trying to do is to contest ground, to demonstrate to the Afghan people that the government cannot give them security, cannot provide them with services, cannot even hold its current position in the country. It's that kind of attempt to break down any confidence in the government, rather than full frontal assaults and attempts to occupy large tracts of ground or major cities.
Yeah, Edmund, thank you for that answer, and I think you really hit on what I was hoping to hear, so I described the work that I do. Look, and I'm tracking this daily, right? I'm trying to understand what's happening. But at the end of the day, my map is a picture, and I kind of look at it. It's sort of like a Monet. Well, it's probably a lot worse picture.
It's not that great.
Artist.
Reality check, though. It's not that great.
Okay,
So
the style of painting like a Monet, where you're putting the dots down and you draw back and you see a face, right? That's that. Those individuals change a couple of pixels a day or two. So, for instance, your report is as of April, right? The Taliban's overrun 11 districts since then, of much more uncontested. But the picture that you're painting there, 50 to 70% of Afghan outside of government control, that's what the same thing that I'm trying to do with that map. So that's why I was curious as to how do you come to this assessment, and and actually more importantly, of course, what does it actually mean? And that is correct. And I do concur with your assessment. The Taliban, particularly foreign air power, has shown to been very effective at preventing the Taliban from massing in strength. But I think what we're seeing now is the Taliban's realizing that Afghan air power isn't quite as good as the Taliban or as the American air power, and that's why they're able to make some gains over the last several weeks.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, one of our long-standing assessments has been that they were doing exactly what you described, Emmett, in terms of surrounding these provincial capitals, much like tying a noose that they were eventually going to tighten. They waited for the U.S. and NATO forces to withdraw or start withdrawing to then try and take and hold these provincial capitals, and they weren't going to expand the manpower to do so until the special operations forces and air power of the Americans and our allies were out of country, because at that point in time they could probably start taking and holding provincial capitals. So entirely consistent with what you're saying in terms of all this. Let's move on to real quick. Here's one of the long-standing things that we've talked about too. In your report, you guys conclude that the Taliban and al-Qaeda remain closely aligned and show no indication of breaking ties, and that the UN's member states report no material change to this relationship, which has grown deeper as a consequence of personal bonds of marriage and shared partnership and struggle, now cemented through second generational ties. So as I read that, I guess that you guys have come to the same conclusion that we have, that there's no indication of any kind of real break between the Taliban and al-Qaeda, and there's a lot of indications that the two remain intertwined.
Yeah, that's correct. That's very much our assessment. It's important to highlight the one sort of change that we did note, and which is in the report, which is this point about the Taliban seeking to develop more information and control regarding the presence of foreign elements, foreign fighters in Afghanistan. But I don't want to overstate that, because apart from anything else, of course, gaining information and more control doesn't of itself mean very much. It suggests to me that the Taliban wants to have greater assurance that it's not going to be embarrassed or wrong-footed by something that foreign elements might do in Afghanistan. But it could also be something that the Taliban wants to have that ability to curb those elements if things change in such a way that it suits them to do so. So I think it's worth noting it. But as I said, it's something that is not of itself a concession by the Taliban, nor is it something that the Taliban could not discontinue or reverse if they chose to do so. What that leaves you with is the continuing close relationship between the two organizations. And of course, what we've seen and we've recorded in the report is a series of high-profile cases of senior al-Qaeda members being killed in Afghanistan, and in each case co-located with the Taliban, and no suggestion there. Again, sort of the evidence from that is that the Taliban are continuing to give these people shelter.
Edmund, if I could follow up, so you had noted a document in there that the Pashto document that began circulating social media, that apparently that purportedly said that the Taliban banned all foreign fighters, but then you go on to note that there's some suspicion about that. Can you discuss that briefly?
I think it's just that there was some communications by the Taliban that seemed to be almost aimed for a foreign audience. There was a feeling that some of the things that were being said were effectively seeking to give a sort of PR support to the idea that they were they were honouring their part of the bargain. That said, I don't want to call into question the idea that they were seeking that information and seeking to register these elements, because I believe that they were.
Yeah, I've heard an additional theory on that too, Evan. I wonder if you've heard it as well, which is that the Taliban is prepared under the newly reconstituted Islamic Emirate to provide refugee status, in effect, to a number of the foreign fighters or foreign elements who are not of necessarily Afghan nationality. That may be one way they also spin such a list, but just obviously it's just conjecture. It's not really known for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's plausible conjecture. I couldn't really add to that.
Gotcha. Now, being a nerd as I am, I read the footnotes. I always read the footnotes because I think the footnotes oftentimes have very interesting little things in it the authors say that catch your eye if you're deeply immersed in this stuff, as we all are. And there's one footnote that talked about Sirajuddin Haqqani, and the footnote noted that in addition to his roles as being a Taliban leader, that he's also assessed to be a member of the wider al-Qaeda leadership, but not of the al-Qaeda core leadership. And then in parentheses says the Teen Shura. Now, this is a very interesting little remark in a footnote here, I was saying, and I don't know if you can elaborate at all on this. I suspect you can't, but I just wanted to raise it because this raises some really interesting questions about the current structure of al-Qaeda and who's who and how some of these figures fit into it. I was wondering if you had anything else you could add or elaborate on that.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not much I can add, Tom. And the reason is goes back to the methodology that we discussed at the beginning, which is that what we're essentially reliant on member state information. And sometimes when you get a piece of information like that, it's so interesting that you feel that you must include it because it feels plausible, and it also feels like a significant thing to mention. But because it was from one member state, we left it in a footnote rather than sort of giving it a paragraph of its own, because we couldn't really have fleshed it out in a way that would have been particularly helpful to readers. So yeah, it's more of a little note. I mean, obviously, Sirajuddin's association with al-Qaeda is very well known, and there's no real issue over that.
Right.
But we were struck by the way that particular information was phrased, and decided to include it in the report.
So on that point, what you just said is exactly what I've been saying to everybody when I read that. I mean, Bill and I could easily produce an encyclopedia of information detailing the Haqqani's role with al-Qaeda since the 1980s, and Siraj's role in particular. You can point to all sorts of evidence on that as well, including from Bin Laden's files and other things. But it was a type of organizational detail that, if true, it's interesting because it tells you something about that al-Qaeda, how its structure is currently constituted. Now, the other part, by the way, I've also been snooping around, as you probably could tell by my write-up at FDU's Longwood Journal, to find out more about this from people, and have found some other conjecture about it or some other suspicions about it. It's possible, based on the sources I've talked to, that he actually holds a seat on one or more of the other Shura councils within al-Qaeda, is the way it's been phrased to me, which Bill reported many years ago that, in fact, Sirajuddin Haqqani actually held a seat on the al-Qaeda Shura Council at one point, but that was long ago. So we're trying to figure out where he sits now. But now let me ask you a question on the latter half of that footnote as well, because you mentioned the Teen Shura, which is something I was very excited about this because, as Bill knows, I've been hearing about the Teen Shura for a while, but we haven't. It's the first time we've seen an official document actually discuss it in any way or even mention it. And the Teen Shura, as far as I can tell, based on sources I've talked to within al-Qaeda, is basically, and I don't know if you guys are doing any work on this, but is basically like the supreme body within al-Qaeda currently. It's basically the major decision-making body. I don't know if what you've heard about the Teen Shura can share with us.
Yeah, I mean, it's first of all, I should say that I have to be a little bit cautious on this point because we're likely to cover this in some detail in our next report.
I hope so.
So it's one of those things that still has to go through the process. Again, our processes are not just that we gather information, but that we also have this, the group of us then take collective editorial responsibility for what is published. And so not having gone through that process yet, I don't want to lean too far forward on this issue. But yes, undoubtedly, it's an important leadership body. And I think what we can say of Al-Qaeda is that they have a sort of dispersed leadership model of necessity, really. They've always been willing to acknowledge people who are key leaders, even though they're not necessarily co-located with one another. And so there's a complexity about the Al-Qaeda leadership. Specifically on the Teen Committee or their Teen Shura, it is something that member states are aware of and that they talk about. But as you say, it remains a subject that is not particularly well understood, particularly not widely understood.
No, and that's a key theme of our podcast, is trying to explore these issues in greater detail. So I really appreciate your candor in terms of explaining how you're thinking through this stuff carefully to try and do the analysis, figure it out. And we're definitely looking forward to your next report on this, because I think you mentioned in the previous episode of the podcast that you were working on trying to tease out some of the details on the structure of Al-Qaeda, and that's a big lift, not a small lift, I would say, because there's a lot that's unknown and not publicly understood. So we appreciate that effort.
And of course, as we mentioned in this report as well, it's particularly timely to look at because of the probable compromised state of health or worse of the leader Ayman al-Zawahiri. So in circumstances where Al-Qaeda must be grappling with the succession issue, it becomes particularly timely and important to understand the way that their leadership works.
Now, Bill, you had noticed some language in the report too, the most recent report from Edmund Fitton-Brown and his team for the UN Security Council about the foreign fighters in Afghanistan. I was wondering if you had some questions on that.
Yeah, Edmund, it's more of a general question. So, in the foreign fighters section, you have, you list several groups. Obviously, one of the largest being the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan. You mentioned Islamic movement in Uzbekistan, Turkestan Islamic Party. Now, some of these groups, for instance, the Turkestan Islamic Party, its leader is also essentially an al-Qaeda member. He's led al-Qaeda's, at least the reporting that we've seen, he's led al-Qaeda's.
He's been on the al-Qaeda Shura Council.
Been on the al-Qaeda Shura Council, led their military formations in the Afghan-Pakistan border area. So while they are...
he was also, by the way, on the ledger of the monthly accounting, some of the ledgers found on Osama bin Laden's compound. He was getting a monthly stipend, according to those ledgers, from bin Laden himself personally, which is his personal bankroll, which is interesting, talking about Abdul Haq al-Turkestani. Okay, go ahead, Bill, sorry.
Yeah. So I guess my general question is, well, yes, these would be foreign fighters outside of, you sort of list them separately from Al-Qaeda, whereas I guess Tom and I would view them as just being part of Al-Qaeda's network. Essentially local Al-Qaeda affiliates that are organized often on ethnic or regional grounds. Would you agree or disagree with that assessment?
I wouldn't. I mean, I wouldn't sort of strongly disagree, Bill. I think it's more a question of emphasis. I remember us having this conversation once before, where I think you gave a very, very persuasive analysis of the size of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and the figure you would have given for it was considerably higher than the one that we've given in the report. Now, it's not that I disagree with that. It's more that we seek to separate out these different elements within the sort of extremist milieu in Afghanistan. So we refer to Al-Qaeda senior leadership, which I think is a fairly clear-cut sort of concept. We also refer to Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, which again, I think is a reasonably clear-cut concept. And of course, on slightly different part of the spectrum, we talk about ISIL Khorasan, and we also talk plenty about the Taliban. But then you have all of this other sort of spectrum of extremists, as you referred to it, particularly this extremely large contingent of TTP. And I think what's interesting about that for us is that some of these groups we see as being, Al-Qaeda aligned. I mean, I completely take your point about Turkestani. Some of them we would sort of characterize as being very specifically Taliban aligned, but how different are those two concepts when we say that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are also aligned with each other? So in a sense, we're talking about things that are not that different in the shade of meaning. But the reason I think it's important to single these groups out and to look at their individual objectives, whether they're Uzbek groups or other sort of Central or East Asian groups, or whether they're Pakistani groups, or all of the different shades that you have there. It's because of this dynamic with the peace process and with ISIL Khorasan, and the fact that ISIL Khorasan is clearly its plan is to draw to it people who don't want to be part of whatever it is the Taliban is doing in Afghanistan, and particularly if it's a real peace process with compromise being made, and therefore doesn't sort of fit the kind of the idea of most of these guys of what the future should be, then ISIL is poised to try to recruit these people and bring them on board. And this is the sort of the short to medium threat that we refer to from ISIL, that although its numbers are down and it's suffered a lot of military setbacks, we still see it as very dangerous, and we see it as potentially very attractive to anyone who gets disillusioned with the process going forward. Now, the final part of my answer to your question is that I think we also have to reflect on the fact that some people actually have loyalties that either float or are not sincerely expressed. And definitely when you think back to the event in Jowzjan in 2018, where you had that Uzbek Taliban group who defected to ISIL, and then they'd already defected, and then they were put down in summer 2018, partly by action by the government and its allies, and partly by Taliban action. And I think what you have operating here is a certain amount of Taliban intimidation and coercion. The Taliban does not like being crossed, and the message from the rough handling of that cell in Jowzjan was, you don't get to leave the Taliban, you don't get to break with us, you don't get to defy us, you don't get to contest our space or contest our resources. And so we try to make sure that we refer to these groups as by their individual identities, whilst acknowledging that they're aligned with the Taliban or aligned with al-Qaeda or with both, but also allowing for the possibility that some members of the groups may entertain ISIL sympathies, and some may even end up breaking away and joining ISIL.
Yeah, and to your point, Edmund, that group in Jowzjan, that was the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, and it was upset over the Taliban playing Weekend at Bernie's with Mullah Omar and propping him up, a dead guy, and pretending he was alive. So that is something, and I agree with you. It is important to understand who the groups are individually. And I just, I think you do a fantastic job of this, by the way, in the report. This is more of a question for the audience than myself, because I know your answer. You answered two other questions within there. And I guess one that I would have had, one other question I do have for you is that you note at the very top of this, the Taliban persistently denies that any foreign fighters are inside Afghanistan. And here you go. You document, 10,000 just that are not specifically, defined as al-Qaeda, explicit al-Qaeda here. And then whatever the estimate is, obviously the Taliban's not going to take credit for the Islamic State, its enemy. So I just find that very interesting. And it's just more evidence that, I got tired at one point in time writing up when the Taliban would deny, ever having foreign fighters in the country or in its ranks or allied with it. And, this report does a fantastic job of debunking that.
Well, and we have to keep restating it, Bill, don't we? Because in the end, the Taliban are claiming to want to be taken seriously as a responsible party in Afghanistan and a future party of government in Afghanistan. And that means that they need to be able to hold credible discussions with both with other Afghans and with international partners. And if they're going to do that, they need to stop telling things that that are obviously untrue.
Yeah, and look, and I'm not going to draw you into a policy debate here. That's not your place. I understand that. Reason that Tom and I we don't object to negotiating with the Taliban if you can do so on fair terms. If there were defined goals and enforcement mechanisms. But when the Taliban just outright lies about how many foreign fighters are in country, they put that number at 0, and we, any rational person knows the number is greater than 10,000. there's a big chasm there to fill. As a matter of fact, you can't fill that chasm. Someone's lying here, and we know it's not you.
Well, and of course, it comes straight back to counterterrorism as well, doesn't it? And the whole point is here that is the Taliban potentially a credible partner for counterterrorism? They need to speak honestly about what the problem is inside Afghanistan in that case.
Right. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it's all, we just, I get so frustrated on this issue. I'm even at a lack of words here, but it's easy to see these problems aren't very difficult to get to the bottom to, and yet the U.S. signed a deal with the Taliban, and people are still talking as the Taliban's carrying out, a massive amount of violence, which you excellently document in this report, and it's taking over a territory and whatnot, and how people could still talk about peace at this point in time. The Taliban's talking about war. The Taliban's conducting war. It's not just talking about it, it's doing it. And that's where, you can't negotiate with a partner that isn't credible, that isn't honest.
So, we mentioned ISIS. Let's move on to what the report says about the ISIS Khorasan branch, because there's some interesting details in the report along those lines as well. And it's something I've been wanting to do more on, and I wanted to pick your brain a little bit on this, Edmund. So you guys talk about the leader of ISIS Khorasan as Shahab al-Muhajir, and describe him as an ambitious new leader. Those are your words. And then there was a very interesting point here where you explained that according to the information you guys have received from the member states, that he's coordinating his operation with an ISIS office known as Al-Sadiq, and that office oversees the so-called caliphate's operations throughout all of Central and South Asia. And I think you guys listed that includes Afghanistan, Bangladesh, India, Maldives, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and the Central Asian republics. It's a very interesting couple passages there along those lines. I was wondering if you could discuss a little bit, because again, we talk about how the organizational structure of al-Qaeda is not well understood, and here's a point on the ISIS side to try and understand how they're currently constituted.
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. I'm glad you highlighted this one, because it's sort of emerging information, really. We also we don't usually refer to other arenas in our Afghan report, but we did just name check Somalia, simply because we see this as, we understand from member states that this is part of an emerging ISIL regional structure related to its directorate of provinces. And that this is, because this goes back to the defeat in Iraq and then Syria, and ISIL having to try to structure itself globally in such a way that it would be able to withstand the shock of that defeat. And the concept then was to have these regional groupings where you would have effectively hubs and spokes around the world, and you would put your regional coordination office wherever your most secure hub was. And that would then take care of the need for ISIL presences to support each other and to promote future interoperability, and ultimately for that to fuel a future global capability. And of course, we've talked previously about the fact that ISIL had to fold its external operations capability. But of course, this is another vehicle potentially for regenerating that external operations capability if you have these relatively well formed regional structures, and you're then able to bed those down and to generate the resource and the ambition and the communications that would enable that to project an external threat. So that's the significance of this. It's why we dwell on it a little bit. Why we also refer to the fact that there's a parallel structure that's discernible in East and Central Africa. We noted that these are two separate individuals, Shahab al-Muhajir, who is the head of ISIL Khorasan, and then the separate head of the Al-Sadiq office, and that they're co-located effectively. I mean, as in Al-Sadiq office is also located with ISIL Khorasan, and that also that although their two mandates are ostensibly somewhat contradictory, because if you're struggling and you're under military pressure to maintain your activities in Afghanistan, then how easily can you spare the bandwidth to try to play a coordinating role and take the risk of communicating outside Afghanistan? That just struck me as an interesting question. But the answer that we've had from member states up to now is that there's no sign of any tension between those missions, and that those missions are functioning together without friction.
Now, is it your sense too that that's obviously your sense too, but I just want to clarify: is this something post Baghdadi and post the fall of the caliphate that they instituted a new infrastructure, sort of a new regime that they came up with or devised to sort of evolve? And so they evolved on, they of course had this wilayat or this provincial infrastructure for a long time, which was meant to initially compete with al-Qaeda and try and pull resources away from al-Qaeda's branches, which are often called affiliates. And that structure, what's interesting about your reporting is it suggests to me that ISIS is evolving its infrastructure, its whole way of doing business, its hierarchy, in order, decentralizing, however you want to put it, in order to try and keep going with the punches, basically keep rolling and keep operations going.
Yeah, exactly so. And I mean, the genesis is 2017 to 2019, and that period when ISIL knew that it was losing and knew that it was going to be militarily defeated in Syria, and had time to think about what that would mean. So it's not really post-Baghdadi. Baghdadi was still in charge at the time, and this is a concept that he was also involved in giving birth to. But it's evolved since then, inevitably, I think, evolved under his successor and under the circumstances of trying to make sense of the post-Baghouz sort of challenge.
Now, just to follow up on his successor, is it your sense too then that this office, Al-Sadiq, and the comparable office in East Africa are reporting up the chain to Abu Ibrahim al-Qureshi, the successor to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi? So it is part of an internal infrastructure, in other words.
Absolutely, as far as they're able to. I mean, we mustn't ever exaggerate. We must never underestimate the difficulty that they have in communication. You know, it is difficult. Communication is a risk in itself. They still do it, and they still move money. And we know that the instructions of ISIL Corps do reach these regional groupings and the affiliates. But yes, it is an intentional structure that's been created. But as you said, there is also a certain amount of delegation of authority and decentralization that goes with it. And that's simply inevitable. If you imagine attempting to operate close command and control in these circumstances, then the leader would just end up being tracked down and killed.
Yeah, it's what I've always, on the decentralization point, I think there's a confusion in terms in the field where decentralization sometimes is used to imply a lack of cohesion, which I don't think is right. I think, any modern international organization is going to have decentralization. Look at any Western company, for example, there has to be decentralization of command to make decisions on a local basis. And then you basically, the central command of the company or the corporate headquarters then reviews the performance of these individual, decentralized units to try and see if they need to be made changes or updates, that sort of thing. And it's similar to that. I mean, you don't expect Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi before he was killed, or his successor Abu Ibrahim to be deciding on what truck to target on a day-to-day basis over in West Africa or East Africa or Afghanistan or anywhere else. But in terms of saying strategic policy making and weighing on some decisions, we have seen quite a bit of evidence through the years that they do that, and sometimes more than that. Sometimes they get down to the details.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Tom. I mean, you're right. There is no contradiction there, and certainly ISIL is quite cohesive in its messaging and in its policy. And it's striking that ISIL Corps has intervened in changing some of the leaders of some of the affiliates, even since the death of Baghdadi. So there's still a certain amount of command and control, but they've had to loosen the reins a little bit, and they've had to ease off on communication.
No, that entirely makes sense. Follow-up question there too. I noticed in this report and previous reports, you guys have discussed how Shahab al-Muhajir, the leader of ISIS Khorasan, basically there's evidence or indications that he possibly was a member of the Haqqani network before joining and defecting in the ISIS ranks. It sort of goes to your previous point about how there's some fluidity here of these groups and how guys can move back and forth at times. And then I know there was one theory that was put forward that basically ISIS Khorasan at sometimes was acting, there's different versions of it, acting in some way in concert with the Haqqanis, to execute large-scale attacks, or possibly as a cutout for the Haqqanis at times. It's sort of murky. I mean, I know there's a lot of ambiguity there. I was wondering if you had any updates on how you guys see that relationship now between somebody like Shahab al-Muhajir and his former companions in the Haqqani network, what that relationship is, how do you think that's all working these days?
Yeah, I think you used the word murky, and it's a good word for this. It isn't very clear to us, and it's important to say also that not all member states agree with each other about it either. So, in other words, you get quite different accounts of this depending on who you're talking to, which makes our job of triangulation more difficult in this particular case than it usually is. I think one of the things that most people accept is that there's a fair amount of fluidity between people. You've got an awful lot of people who are sort of terrorist technicians, really, and available for hire. They'll work for whoever pays them in some cases. I think there certainly are people who go back and forth between the Haqqani network and ISIL Khorasan, and then the question arises of how far is that a sort of a conscious and directed policy of ISIL Khorasan, of the Haqqani network, and that we cannot be clear on. We're just not sure about that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we were monitoring attacks in Kabul, for example, in particular, and very early on, Bill and I were talking about how these were the Haqqanis played a key role in the Kabul attack network with other al-Qaeda, parts of al-Qaeda and others, and you can see there's a lot of evidence along those lines. And then all of a sudden, ISIS is able to execute some of these same types of attacks in same types of places. And it did raise the question whether or not there was a conscious decision, as you say, to facilitate ISIS doing this against targets that they didn't want to claim responsibility for hitting, or if it was a matter of poaching, that they had basically poached from the Haqqanis and others ISIS had in order to do this, or if there was some other sort of in between, some sort of facilitation agreement in between that, or facilitators, as you say, doing some sort of work in between those two competing paradigms for understanding it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I mean, we did point out the possibility of of more collaboration in our 11th report, but in this latest report, the 12th report, we haven't been able to develop that or to establish any more certainty about it.
That makes sense. Bill, you have any other questions?
Just one quick, and how do you assess attacks, high-profile attacks that are executed in places like Kabul, where no one takes credit for them? Attacks where we all know the Islamic State would claim credit for the most mundane attack, even if there were no casualties. They're very eager to show their presence, and it attacks in a mode that we're familiar with, right? Attacks that Haqqani network or the other Taliban groups are known to conduct. Does that not give more credence to the theory that there's collusion between the Taliban and the Islamic State, or more specifically Haqqani and Islamic State in certain instances?
Yeah, I mean, let's take that in also in two parts, because it's worth just touching also on the separate issue, or somewhat separate issue of targeted assassinations, because we refer to that in the report. Yes. And we conclude that we offer the member state view that maybe 85% of these attacks are carried out by the Taliban, and that's interesting, because those are attacks that they don't claim, but which are clearly designed to undermine the morale of the government, the morale of civil society, the willingness of ordinary Afghans to work with the government, or to work in areas like journalism where they're likely to be, there's evidence that they're likely to be targeted. So that's an important point. And that I think is indicative of the sort of the Taliban approach. They're perfectly happy to do this and not to claim things, because it's convenient not to claim them and to leave the sort of the room for doubt that it might be somebody else doing it. So I mean, I think that's worth mentioning, because it plays into the other point, and your other point, which is the main point you were making, which is about the sort of larger attacks, if you like, where and I think it would consistent with what Tom was just saying as well, where you might say that looks as if it's some aspects of the attack bear the signature of the Haqqani network, or something, or seem to be along the lines of those sort of tactics that, or the techniques that you would expect the Haqqani network to be capable of. Yeah, I mean, is that sufficient evidence to say that there is institutional collusion between the Haqqani network and ISIL Khorasan? I think, as we've said in the 12th report, that's something on which member states do not agree with each other. But if you go back to the fact that there are people going back and forth, that there will be times when an attack is just in the interests of both groups, because it undermines security, particularly in Kabul. It undermines the morale of the government. It undermines the functioning of the government, distracts government resource, and prevents the government from doing what it might otherwise be doing. If you're in a situation in a multi-sided conflict, complex multi-sided conflict like this, and both of those two groups benefit from an attack, one of them benefits from claiming it, the other benefits from not being held responsible for it, I think you can draw your own conclusion.
No, that makes sense. And that shows, that again speaks to the complexity in teasing all this out and figuring out exactly what's going on in some of these theaters. I want to thank you. I don't know if you have anything else you want to add, Edmund, to our podcast here for listeners. Anything else you want to say about the work you guys are doing at all, or if there's anything else you want to share with listeners? I promised you we were going to get you out of here in a much more timely fashion than we did last time when we held you up, and you were very gracious about it. But I kept to a tight script this time to get you out of here. So
yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I would add, Tom, and it goes back to where we left one little exchange with Bill, and that was. I do want to emphasise that I and the monitoring team do not share that level of scepticism about the prospects for peace in Afghanistan. Our job is to highlight the reality on the ground, and that reality is very challenging, and the behaviour of the Taliban is very challenging. But that's not to say that it's hopeless. I think that the 1988 committee, the sanctions regime, work of the monitoring team has a role to play in creating the conditions where the Taliban recognize that they do need to negotiate to some degree. I think we've had this conversation before about just how strong is the Taliban militarily. I don't think that they have an easy option simply to overrun Afghanistan by force. They're very, as I said earlier, they're very good at contesting space. And of course, as you said, they may well do a much better job of dominating or controlling space if they're facing a weakened Afghan government. But that's not to say that it's a cost-free exercise for them to contemplate simply fighting to the bitter end. If there's an opportunity for them to achieve some of their goals through negotiation. And it is important, I think, that the international community continues to work with them and also put pressure on them to negotiate.
Edmund, I greatly appreciate that and your impartiality and all the work you do. I do hope I'm wrong about this and that something some good could come of it. And thank you for all the work that you and your team does, and we look forward to all your reports in the future.
Yeah, and I'll just add that you can leave the extreme skepticism to the two of us.
Yes, that's our job. That's our job.
Yeah. So, in any event, Edmund Fitton-Brown, thank you for joining us on the podcast this week. We really appreciate it. Just for our listeners, a reminder, he's the coordinator of the United Nations Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team. They cover ISIS, al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and affiliated groups. Thank you again, Edmund. It's been our pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Bill. Great pleasure, and looking forward to next time. Take care.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Generation Jihad. Please do subscribe to the show. As a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your shows. And by the way, Bill, I've got to copy that part. Doing these recordings, I'm always looking for that language to copy and paste like I read at the end of these podcasts.
Just pre-record it, lay it down,
lay it down, just do it over and over again. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. Bye.